Good evening, everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to join. But while you're waiting, please introduce yourselves in the chat so that we can see who's joining us tonight. Susie, would you mind bringing us tonight? We've got 300 people signed up to the webinar, which is absolutely fantastic. Okay, while we're waiting, I'll introduce you to our agenda for this evening. So we're going to start this evening with a policy update from Robin Milton, who is our trustee who leads on policy. He's going to be followed by Adrian Colston, and then Tamsin Thomas from Dartmoor Land Use Management Group. We've got Mariecia Fraser from Aberystwyth University, who's been working alongside Tamsin. We've got John Howell and Philip French from Dartmoor. They'll be talking about the work they've been doing on their common. And then Iona Blockley will be joining us from the Elan Valley. After that, we'll be having a Q&A. While we're talking about Q&A, there is a Q&A function in the chat. Oh, sorry, not in the chat. So we have a chat function and a Q&A function. So please feel free to have put comments in the chat. But if you've got a question, please add it to the Q&A, and our panelists will be able to answer that while the webinar is running. Okay, I think we've got everyone joining us. Okay. Can we see? So we can see who's joined us tonight. So we've got a fantastic mix there. We've got 38% farmers, 11% common land owners. We've got land agents, commoners. So you can see there a real variety of people joining us, which is fantastic. So I'm going to pass over to Robin Milton, who will be sharing our policy update.
Good evening, everybody. And as I did put in the chat just now, I'm a Foundation for Common Land trustee, as well as an Exmoor farmer and commoner. We have, through FCL, been cooperating with DEFRA and the RPA, looking at implementation of the current ELM schemes on common land. And this is an update as we know it so far. It has been approved by them. We have checked through with it. So please, this is not to be regarded as criticisms in any way. This is a work in progress, and it's an update, current situation as we know it. Any questions, please remember, put them in the Q&A, and we'll go from there. It's the current situation, factual as we see it. A couple comments, really. I will attempt to explain more. There will be a press release going out after this. If anybody's got any questions, Q&A, please. And we will take it from there. So, first slide there. Just a statement of fact, Sustainable Farming Incentive, regrettably, SFI MOR1 has been removed from SFI 26. Very disappointing and the reasoning been given that it's using the old software, and the software is struggling for capacity. So there is no access to SFI for Commons in 2026 because it cannot be enabled, we are told, to process common land parcels. There is also the problem of the 100,000 SFI cap, which means that many commons could potentially be ineligible even if they were able to join, or at least would be limited in what they could achieve. We've got commons even taking the most limited number of moorland options that would be well above this. The only thing we can say there, we have requested an offline process, and that's principally where we are with this. So I'll just put the health warning at the bottom as well. It's still in development. It's subject to change, and we're very much hoping that that will be absolutely the case as we go forward. Right, we'll move on, please. So, countryside stewardship higher tier. There's a good many people have been waiting, assuming that with the extension, with the rollovers to HLS, they'll be able to move relatively seamlessly into CS higher tier to deliver more and to maintain that kind of income into the sustainable management of commons. However, it does require you to be on the Natural England pipeline, pre-app advice, and then applying, unfortunately, via the Abaco Agri system, which, of course, as I said before, doesn't work for commons. It's not enabled to process commons parcels. Only way out of this, and it's something, again, that we've done for a good many years through HLS and so on, an offline process. Unfortunately, that offline process is currently not available. We'll move on. Higher level stewardship. An awful lot of people are in higher level stewardship at the moment, including upland and lowland commons. So the numbers are quite stunning, and I think I could go into the numbers. I don't want to spend too much time over this. I want this to be a brief update. The majority of these HLS agreements will expire 27-28. Unfortunately for us, first of all, the system for moving from HLS to CS higher tier, as I mentioned on the previous slide, is currently not there, and we have been given no definite time that they feel that may be there. So the logical thing you would expect would be at least give the opportunity to increase higher level stewardship payment rates to match, but there is no proposal to do that either. The only real option may be, and it's something that we have asked for, have talked about with DEFRA and RPA, is maybe further HLS rollovers may be the only way forward. It will mean that those people are getting less from their agreement for an expectation to deliver than could have been expected through CS higher tier, which is very disappointing and not how we expected the scheme to work. Again, one option only, an offline process. It's been done before, as I've said. And next, please. So, state of play so far. We're on landscape recovery is the one part that seems to be going ahead. But unfortunately, we're pretty limited in the number of delivery plans with commons that have been submitted to DEFRA. There are the two listed on your screen. There is really a significant issue with this on the 12-month break clause, and concerns have been raised about the level of work and the level of commitment required and the structure that has to surround this with the multiple people engaged with it, where there's a 12-month break clause on DEFRA's side, but a considerably longer expectation of delivery on those on the ground. We have yet to see, there is no third round landscape recovery yet confirmed, and as yet, until we see exactly what the results of the ones submitted are, we're really not sure whether they're likely to deliver on common land. And next, please. So, not a lot of good news so far in what I've actually said. In reality, common land has once again been left out. It's been left right until the end. It happens every time. I would have expected the lessons to have been learnt by now. Evidently, they're not. Basically, if a scheme could work for a common, it will work everywhere. But functionality within the systems has not been kept up to speed enough to facilitate it. So we've got a few positive actions. One, we can keep talking, and we will continue discussions with DEFRA, with RPA. I'm continuing that tomorrow on behalf of FCL. You can engage with independent support, whether it's be collaboration funds, farming and protected landscapes. Those schemes are out there for commons. Can discuss future management options with commoners, landowners, and other stakeholders. Principally, whatever happens, we need to know. You need to know what people's plans are, what thoughts are, and probably the most important thing of all, to keep those people there engaged with direction. Because the difficulty is, if there is a change in policy here that allows us, or change in the access and availability of these schemes. We don't want to be starting from scratch again in getting people engaged. I think preparation will be important, whether it be PA2 plans, tree for restoration, planting, capital works. Where MR1 data has been collected, it can be made best use of. That is one of the most disappointing things about that not being available for Commons at the moment. The opportunity to use that data to progress through to other schemes and ensure you've got the right kind of activity will likely be lost. And ecological surveys, obviously, that is part of that direction in order in pulling together something. But until we've got a process, and until we've got, at the moment, the only way I see is an offline process, because I can't see development of the computer systems being fast enough. We need a team that can facilitate and manage common land activity offline. From a point of view of anyone else involved, write to your MP, raise the issue. Support from the likes of NFU, CLA, TFA. I think the more this issue is raised, the greater will be the understanding of the concerns of those on Commons and of the concerns for those administering the schemes. We're there, from our point of view, we're there to help those people, help DAFRA, help RPA. If we can help facilitate Commons being included, we will have achieved our objectives. We'll also be coordinating a national alliance with interest in Commons, whether that be RSPB, Wildlife Trust, National Trust, open spaces, protected areas, etc. It will be a case of ensuring we do not let the situation on Commons slip off the top of the agenda. Now we've got it there, let's make sure it works. Any questions, please put them forward. There will be a press release going out. Thank you for listening. I hope I've made reasonable sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. And I will reiterate Robin's point about working together. We are going to be looking over the next few weeks about how we work together as a community, everyone involved on Commons. So I'll be sending you a MailChimp letting you know of the progress. If you haven't signed up to our newsletter, please do so. There'll be a slide at the end. So I'm going to pass on now to Adrian Colston, who's going to talk to us about his work and his experience of Molinia on Dartmoor.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Adrian Colston. I'm an ecological consultant, a rural social scientist, and I'm an associate research fellow at the Centre for Rural Policy Research at Exeter University. Back in 23, 24, 25, we were commissioned by the Forest of Dartmoor Commoners Association, Harford and Ugborough Commoners Association, the Foundation for Common Land, and we were funded by FIPL to carry out some work to try and work out what the extent of Molinia was on Dartmoor and what could be done about it in terms of management by commoners. We've produced a report called Dartmoor's Molinia Management Trials, trying to understand an unpalatable problem, research findings and conclusions. Now, if you want to see that report, I suggest you go on and you Google a Dartmoor blog, and my blog will come up, and it's the second entry on my blog, so you can download it from there. So the first question we wanted to ask ourselves really was, where has all this Molinia come from? And I think the key point to make about Molinia is that it is a constant, as we call it in botanical terms. In blanket bog, in wet heath and in dry heath, Molinia is found pretty much in all the quadrats that we look at. What has happened in recent times, or maybe not so recent times, is it's got really quite out of kilter. So if we go back to, say, the time of transhumance in the 16, 17, 1800s, very large numbers of animals coming onto Dartmoor from South Hams and from north of the moor, huge numbers of animals eating things. At that time, Dartmoor's hydrology was a great deal better than it is now, and the blanket bog areas of the moor were basically out of reach for grazing animals. It was just too wet. So at that time, Molinia was being eaten. If we then kind of get forward to the headage days, there's a lot of animals up there. They've been able to go into the areas of blanket bog now because that is now hydrologically not functioning properly as a result of things historically such as peat cutting, tin streaming, drainage, droughts, and more recently climate change. As a result of that, there are a lot of animals up there, and not all of the millennia got eaten. But the practices during the headage days was that it was kind of burnt off so that next spring it would give a fresh bite. We then get through to when the ESA comes in, and when we get the ESA in 1995 on Dartmoor, what we see is a 50% reduction in the number of sheep, 50% reduction in the number of cattle, and the banning of the outwintering of cattle. That led to a reduction in grazing pressure. That tied in with foot and mouth in 2001-2. We suddenly started seeing millennia come back in again. And as the swaling regimes now were not burn whole hillsides to get rid of millennia, it grew and grew and grew. So we've now got to a situation where millennia is a big issue on Dartmoor. So if we look at just some very quick statistics, there are two big sites of special scientific interest on Dartmoor. The North Dartmoor SSSI, which is now 53% ungrazed millennia, and that's over 7,100 hectares. The South Dartmoor SSSI is 51% ungrazed millennia, which is 3,670 hectares. So it is a major issue. And taking the Forest of Dartmoor, the big central common, that's got 71% ungrazed millennia. So it is a big, big issue. So what we were trying to do was to say, what can be done about this, if anything? And because at the moment, as you will know, as farmers and commoners, ungrazed, unpalatable millennia does not really appeal to animals, so they don't go into it. Millennia, when it grows in May, June, and July, is a very palatable grass. But once it gets beyond that and starts to go into that kind of raffia brown color, it's pretty unpalatable. So we came up with some projects with various commoners to try and work out what we could do. So we set up 9 different trial sites. And we tried different interventions: rolling, cutting, harrowing, double harrowing, and fire. So the trial sites were basically using rolling, cutting, and harrowing. We picked a few other sites around the moor where things had happened previously. So, for example, the fire sites, one was an accidental barbecue fire in an area of Molinia, and another one was a military flare, which set some of the moor on fire. So we looked at that. We then did a whole series of nested quadrats in the intervention areas and the adjacent control areas. The control area meaning the area where the millennia is uneaten. And we did about 680 quadrats. Now I need to caveat all of this. This is one piece of work in 1 year. So we can't go forwards or backwards, particularly with this, and it is what it is, but it's going to act, we hope, as a baseline to be able to help us in the future work out what to do. So I think the first thing to say is that cutting and rolling as interventions did have a statistically significant impact on the vegetation. Now, some of this is blindingly obvious, like if you cut grass that has been cut is shorter than grass which has not been cut. So I don't want to try and over egg what we're doing. But what happened was that in these areas of cutting and rolling, and to a lesser extent in the harrowing and the double harrowing, it did attract, in some cases, stock into those areas. So that was the key thing. Areas where stock had previously not been had been attracted into that. There were other areas where the interventions were done and it did not attract stock into it. It wasn't because harrowing or cutting or whatever didn't work. It was just the design of the project meant that perhaps the animals preferred that bit over there because it was more palatable and they didn't have to cross an area of linear to get there, or they didn't find it, or they found it, started to eat there, and then they moved on to better grazing. So there's a kind of key issue that comes into this, is that you need to make sure that you design these areas where you're going to do interventions where there are active layers of either cattle, ponies, or sheep. And one of the interesting things that came out of some of these was trials were that actually we'd thought before that sheep really didn't like Molinia, but when these interventions had happened and cattle had come in to start the process going, sheep would come in as well. And there was a little flock on one common of about 50 sheep, which stayed there the whole summer and quite happily got on with what they were doing. The other thing to say is that the burning that we did, or the burning that was done, not that we did, was all on peat less than 20 centimetres or soil less than 20 centimetres. And our recommendations in that report was that fire is an effective way of doing it, but you need to be very careful that you don't do it on areas of peat or soils over 20 centimetres. Now, I think the key thing with this is managing expectations for this. I think what our work was beginning to show was that if you do certain interventions in certain places and you've got animals in the right place, they will go in and they will eat there. Now, it's only a 1 year study, so we can't say what impact that had on the vegetation. Did it make it better? What happened? We don't know that yet. And hopefully the work that Mariecia is going to talk about a little bit later on will show that, there are plans to look forwards to try and look into those ideas slightly more. But I think the very first thing to say is because of the extent of the Molinia problem on Dartmoor, there aren't enough cattle in Devon. There probably aren't enough cattle in the southwest to do it. And the cattle, along with the ponies, are simply not going to be able to deal with a problem of this scale. So one of the things that we've recommended, and I forgot to say it at the beginning, when I keep saying we, I did this report jointly with Dr. Phil Wilson as well, who's a colleague I work with. And what we basically said in there was that on land that's got peat over 40 centimetres, really what needs to be done there is hydrological work to get the hydrological functioning much, much better. The ecology of Molinia is if you've got basically water which is waterlogged, Molinia doesn't like it very much and it doesn't grow so vigorously. Where you've got a lot of these slopes like we've got on Dartmoor, on the wet heath and things like that, we get what's called the lateral flow of water. The water goes down the hill, and Molinia is quite happy with a lateral flow of water going on it. So what we're really saying is that those big chunks of blanket bog should be really regarded, perhaps in the future, as areas for re-wetting and restoration rather than an attempt to graze the Molinia out of them. And because of the issue about the number of cattle that there are on the moor, and that's going to become an issue, which I'll say something else slightly more in a moment, is that you need to be very targeted about where you can do it. We found the sites which were least likely to actually be effective were remote sites. Ones that took a long time to get there, took a long time to get cattle out there, and maybe the cattle were moving through and then moving on somewhere else. So those were the least effective of those sites. So I think we can really say that in addition, two of these sites, they were very, very successful, but they were quite small sites, and these were the ones that were done historically. And both of those sites have now ended up being overgrazed, basically. So what you need to do if you're going to start on this process is you don't just do the cut 1 year. You need to have cuts moving around the common so that you can actually move the animals about. Otherwise, they'll stay in one place and they overgraze it. And so that's one thing I think which is quite important. And I think it's all about being realistic. What can be achieved? What kind of sizes of areas can actually be done? And tying that in with the availability of cattle and ponies and to see what can happen. Now, obviously, what has been going on in the background is countryside stewardship higher tier. And at the moment, we don't have enough animals on Dartmoor with an average of about 0.32 livestock units per hectare. If people are going to go into countryside stewardship higher tier, as it stands at the moment, the most the highest grazing level is going to be 0.016 livestock units per hectare, which is going to be half of what we've got now. And if you want to go in and get potentially some of the bigger money, despite the caveats that Robin has just come up with, is you're going to have to keep reducing stock down to lower levels, remove stock in the winter, maybe only graze for 4 months. If commons go into that kind of regime, managing Molinia via animals is a non-starter. So if you want to know more, it's in the report, and you can download that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Hugely useful. And Tamsin has added that report into the chat. So if you'd like to see that, you can go there now. So Tamsin Thomas is both FCL and the Dartmoor Land Use Management Group, where she works part of the time. And she's just going to introduce you to the work that they've been doing and then introduce you to our following speakers. So thank you, Tamsin.
Oh, thanks, Lindsay, and thanks so much, Adrian. You've provided a really good background to why we're doing the work that we're doing on Dartmoor with Molinia. So, Owen, next slide, or the slide for the first slide, please. So this is a picture of Harford Moor, where we've been carrying out Molinia interventions over the past 3 to 4 years, and will continue to do so as part of the Dartmoor land use management trials. So the management these trials are also part funded by the Farming and Protected Landscapes scheme. So just to give you next slide, please. Just to give you a brief overview of the Dartmoor Land Use Management Group. So we're an independent advisory group established following a government review in 2023. Our purpose is to ensure the appropriate future management of Dartmoor's protected landscape and the creation of a multifunctional land use framework to improve outcomes for people and nature. The group is independently chaired by Phil Stocker and works to encourage collaboration, cooperation and trusted relationships between all those with a responsibility to manage the Dartmoor National Park land area, ensuring it's an environmentally resilient landscape underpinned by viable and sustainable farming businesses. Thank you. And next slide, please. So why do these trials matter? Well, the first review made it clear that Dartmoor needs a more robust, consistent evidence base to guide decisions on grazing and habitat recovery. And the Dartmoor Land Use Management Group has echoed this, calling for coordinated practical trials that can genuinely inform management. Molinia dominance remains a major constraint on habitat condition, grazing value, wildfire risk, and the visibility of archaeology. And these 3 linked trials that I'm going to talk to you about directly address the evidence gaps identified. Next slide, please. So what are the trials going to test? Well, across the 3 trials, we're testing, similar to before, we're testing cutting, burning and harrowing, as well as pony grazing alone. On Harford and Lidford, we will be using fully replicated block designs to compare interventions under different stocking contexts. And Lakehead Newtake will build on earlier survey work to understand how ponies use Molinia through the season. Together, these trials, they'll give us a structured way to test the practical options that Dartmoor Land Use Management Group and the first in review highlighted as priorities. And next slide, please. So these trials will provide the most robust evidence base we've had on Dartmoor for managing Molinia, backed by, the huge amounts of research that Adrian's already undertaken. They respond directly to the first in review's call for clearer, replicated evidence and support Dartmoor Land Use Management Group's aim of coordinated practical land management guidance. The programme will help us understand which interventions are worth the effort, how livestock respond, and what changes we can realistically expect in vegetation structure and species composition. And so I'm going to pass you on next to Professor Mariecia Fraser, who's the lead scientist and that we're working with on these trials. Thank you, Mariecia.
Thank you very much indeed, Tamsin, and thank you also to the organisers for this opportunity to speak to you tonight. Can I have the first slide, please? So I'm Mariecia Fraser. I'm based at the Prepare and Upland Research Centre, which is part of Aberystwyth University, particularly the IBERS BBSRC Institute within the university. And tonight, I wanted just to do a slightly deeper delve into grazing Molinia, because obviously it's a core part of what we're trying to achieve. Is we've already heard from Adrian, we are understocked on Dartmoor, we've got some issues there. So how do we deploy the animals that we've got access to as effectively as possible? And in doing that, how understanding the differences between different species and what they do helps us guide our decision making. Next slide, please. Adrian's already talked about this, but just as a bit of context, we have had some major changes in uplands, and what we're seeing on commons in England, we're talking about tonight, and mirrored across Wales and in Scotland as well. Overgrazing caused dramatic changes to our upland landscape, obviously fueled by the policies at the time, particularly the headage payments. But then more recently, next slide, we've seen a shift and destocking in a lot of these areas. And so we're moving into a place now where we've got undergrazing or indeed complete abandonment. And what we tend to see there is we have one or two more competitive invasive species taking over, as well as Molinia, rush species and bracken are very common as causing issues. So this is a double whammy then. We get reduced biodiversity because we've lost the floristic diversity, which means we've lost the insect diversity as food sources for birds and mammals. And these grasses or these vegetation communities are poor agriculturally as well. So the feeding value isn't there. So production takes a hit. And over time, access becomes more difficult. And everybody knows the benefits of being able to get out into these spaces, but that starts to suffer too. Next slide. So really, the underlying question to all this is how do we get the balance right? How do we achieve that critical optimum space between overgrazing and undergrazing? So there's a number of critical factors here. We need to think about what's available for grazing, the stocking rate, what are we going to deploy, and when are we going to send those animals out? And collectively, those different factors give us our grazing impact. But just thinking about those in a little bit more detail, in terms of the livestock choice, species is a crucial factor. But breed choice in terms of type, hardy native versus more modern productive stocks important, as is physiological status. Are they growing? Are they pregnant? Are they lactating? All those factors will impact their requirements for protein and energy, and that will in turn influence the choices that they make. Numbers is straightforward enough, although we haven't got time to talk about the many reasons why livestock units is not the way to go about that. But then there's the when as well. When during the growing season, the duration of grazing, and maybe if that's short, frequency of grazing on and off. If there's a potential to control those, obviously with great big open enclosures, that's very, very difficult unless we start to look at interventions. Next slide. Just a little bit deeper into factors influencing the grazing behaviour. On the right are animal factors, so related to the livestock grazing, and on the left are plant factors. So looking at the animal factors first, really the key parameter there is body size. Basically, the rules of how things scale with body size mean that smaller animals have effectively more time per unit of food to search for really good stuff. So they tend to prioritize being selective and finding the most nutritious components within the pasture. Conversely, larger animals like cattle and ponies, they're more driven by maintaining the quantity rather than the quality. And so they'll start to move on to maybe less preferred areas more quickly. Gut type, in terms of whether they're a ruminant like cattle or sheep, or a hindgut fermenter like ponies, makes a difference as well. Impacts their intake levels and their choices. Again, as already mentioned, whether growing, pregnant, lactating, what sort of level of body stores do they have? Are they healthy? Are they carrying parasite burdens? All those things make a difference, as does, not surprisingly, the weather conditions. You're going to prioritize shelter when it's horizontal rain, which it is a lot of the time in these areas. In terms of nutritional value, it's primarily protein and energy. So the animals are looking for plants, parts of plants that will deliver that. They're influenced by how much of the stuff they prefer is available, and then where it is in terms of distance between, so horizontal patchiness, but also where things are in the pasture as well. So the horizontal distribution within the sward, because generally they're only grazing the top proportion of vegetation. So a lot of the more nutritious plants hide at the bottom away from the grazers. And then plant defenses are really important as well. And obviously we can think of thorns, barbs, things like that. But you also get, in terms of physical defenses, grasses such as mat grass, Nardis stricta, little silica hairs all down the leaves that are rough and unpleasant for the animal to handle. And then you get the chemical defenses. So plants such as heather and bilberry are full of tannins, condensed tannins at concentrations that impact intake. They lower the intake and they interfere with the digestion in the animal as well. So they're there to dissuade animals from grazing them. And that's, if at all possible, they will avoid those plant species. Next slide. So we can use the differences in choices of different species to alter sward composition. So this image, at the top, we've got a mixture of grasses and wildflowers. So if you've got animals such as sheep and goats as well that are able to be very selective, and they start to choose to selectively graze the minor components, the wildflowers in this images, it could be the clover in your pasture, then those plants are getting a double whammy in that they're being grazed off and they're also less competitive compared to their neighbouring plants. Conversely, if we have an animal that is prepared to eat the dominant plant species, so maybe they can't be as selective, so cattle on Molinia shifting onto the Molinia more quickly than the sheep, they graze down those dominant plant species, which opens up the sward and allows other things to come through. And this is what we're trying to achieve with a lot of our hill pastures. Next slide. So cattle, we've done a lot of work to show the benefits of cattle in these situations. In terms of their ability to cope with low digestibility, pasture, vegetation, their selective, or more importantly, lack of selective feeding, and also their physical presence. So they're there, they're trampling, opening up ground, creating bare patches where seed bank species can come through and we can encourage diversity. Next slide. But the challenge, particularly in Wales, is we've lost the cattle, and even farmers that are very keen on keeping cattle for their nature value are struggling these days to justify them economically. So what else could we use? How do we get that diversity using other animal species? this little diagram shows so body weight and how that is linked to bigger bodies, generally less selective. And then there's different types of feeder as well. So we go from browsers that prefer shrubs and trees through to animals that definitely prefer grass. And there's some in the middle that will take a mixed diet with maybe a bit more of a preference for browse or for grass. By looking at their feeding behaviour and their size, we can start to put them into different niches here. And that distance between the cattle and the sheep is one of the reasons why mixed grazing with cattle and sheep is so effective in terms of delivering production benefits, because weaned lambs will grow better alongside cattle, but also biodiversity benefits as well. But maybe we are losing those. What are the alternatives? Ponies can occupy a similar but slightly different niche. And we're, as part of our ongoing research at preparing, we're looking at other grazers as well, because that mixed grazing, there's no one species is better than any other. It's the mixture that creates the diversity, and that's what we're trying to encourage. Next slide. So thinking about Molinia in particular, there was some great work done at the Hill Farming Research Organisation back in the 1980s, looking at ways of measuring how much Molinia was being taken off during a growing season. And by looking at different stocking densities and relating that to how much Molinia was being consumed, they were able to show relationships between that utilisation figure and reduction in dominance. And these are some of the figures from that work done by Sheila Grant and colleagues. And so when we had the research farm at Bronith Mower in the Brecon Beacons, we had triple SIs there. All the grazing work that we did, based on that grant work, we were imposing a 50% utilisation target for what we wanted for grazing for the summer. And that kept the triple SIs in favourable condition. So basically with 50%, you're saying you want the animals to be consuming half of the growth for that year. And crucially, rather than saying, right, they're going to go on this date and off on that date, they go on, you keep monitoring, and then the animals come off at that 50%, which could be 10 weeks, some years it was 12 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever, depending on the growing season. So we're using those sorts of techniques as part of the new trials on Dartmoor to try and understand what the animals are doing, and we'd be able to then extrapolate to what the impacts might be in the longer term. Next slide. So just a couple of other things that have come from various bits of research. There is a strong selection of other grasses in preference to Molinia and heather, although thinking about winter time, there's a crucial difference where cattle in particular, once they've switched to heather, because of the way they graze, they're able to take more of the plant, and there's actually potential for more damage to heather at that point, whereas sheep are still really quite selective and take the new growth. But we've shown that over the summer months, if you can target your grazing then by your animals, you reduce that dominance through the utilisation, and you can actually achieve reasonable levels of production performance. In terms of nutritional value, Molinia isn't that bad. Its digestibility isn't too bad at all. Next slide. Oh, there's a little bit of text missing for some reason here. Oh, never mind. So just in summary, we can use different grazers in different ways to achieve the change that we want. And part of that is matching the livestock species and the livestock type to what the goals are. But management needs to be flexible. So the management we put in place to achieve change is going to be different to what we need to put in place once we've achieved that change, because maintenance management is going to have to be different. And then the picture there, climate change. So it's a number of different climates are going to keep impinging on what we're doing. Obviously, there's environmental climate change and the impact that's going to have on these environments. But there's also political climate change and the way that support keeps altering, and maybe what is expected from these areas keeps changing as well, despite the fact that achieving real community change, vegetation community and biodiversity change takes a long time. We're not necessarily getting the backing to achieve that. So then just to finish with a little bit on what we're doing with the trials, Tamsin's already outlined the interventions. As I said, we know we're short of animals in these areas. So what we're looking at is whether by using interventions to increase the proportion of new growth Molinia in these areas, we can attract stock in. So we're targeting the grazing on areas where we really want change to happen. So we'll be looking at the choices the animals are making, the self-imposed stocking rates, and the impact that has in the short term as a way of predicting impacts in the longer term. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There's so much content in there, and I think, like many others, I'll be going back and listening to that again just to really digest all of those details. There's a huge amount in there that's linked to animal husbandry and that relationship between academics, ecologists, and commoners is going to be critical going forward. So I'm going to hand you on now to John Howell and Philip French, landowner and commoner, who are going to give us the practical interpretation of their work on Dartmoor. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. So I'm John Howell. My family owns Harford Moor on the southern edge of Dartmoor.
I'm Philip French. I'm chairman of Harford and Ugbo Commoners after I retired as chairman of the Dartmoor Commoners Council. Thank you.
Can we have the next slide, please? So we're going to talk about the practical implications and activities that we were involved in the Molinia treatments that Adrian Colston was talking about earlier. So these were over 2 years, 2024 and 2025. Next slide, please. So Harford and Ugborough moors form two thin strips of moorland. The very southern edge of Dartmoor is just at the bottom of this map, and the strips are about 7 miles long and about 1/4 of a mile to a mile wide, running up into the blanket bog at the centre of the southern part of Dartmoor. So that's within the South Dartmoor SSSI that Adrian referred to. So on this map, you can see the various heath types. The acid grassland is in the dark blue. And at the northern end, the yellow is Molinia dominance, and the bright blue is an area of good quality blanket bog with a bigger mix of grasses. It's wetter, and the Molinia appears not to have become so dominant there. So our trials were focusing on that yellow area, about 5 miles up into the moor. Next slide, please. So there's an enlargement of that area, and that shows our first set of trials. The orange shapes together form about 30 or 35 hectares of trials. It's a fairly bleak area, and we're doing the work in the winter. So the difficulty of navigating is shown by the picture at the bottom there. So that's me walking in front of the machine doing the work, trying to keep a straight line for him to follow to cut the outline of the plot. So if you look carefully at the orange shapes, you'll see the lines are pretty wiggly because of the clumpy Molinia. The next slide, please. So this is the machine that we were using, a LogLogic soft track. So some of the work was done just with rolling with the tracks. Some of it was done with cutting with the flail. It's about 5 feet wide. It takes a heck of a lot of fuel and energy to run the flail when you're going through this dense, clumpy Molinia. And to begin with, at least, we had problems with it blowing gaskets because of the pressure of going back onto the hydraulic pumps. Next slide, please. And the other treatment we used was with an inverted tine harrow with some tires on for weights. So I think 6 bits of harrow there dragged around about 12 feet wide. And so we did that either with 1 pass or with 2 passes in different directions. That's much faster to do and uses less energy, but it doesn't chomp through the clumps quite as much. So next slide, please.
Thank you. Evening, everyone. I think it's first necessary to say in the areas we were doing these trials that we probably grow limpet-sized Molinia. I mean, the clumps are really large, and in fact, you can't drive quad bikes over them because they'll simply get stuck, they'll belly out on them. That's the sort of terrain that we're in. That's not very well shown through some of the photographs. And our first trials in 2024, the weather was different. It was cool and wet. And interestingly, that sheep that were on a neighbouring common at the top of the hill in the top photograph, that they moved down. I think we did those treatments in early March, and they moved down within about a fortnight of the treatments taking place. On Harford Moor, the cattle also moved up quite frequently from the sweeter areas further down the Molinia. Next slide, please. All treatment types showed the effects throughout the summer. You can see, if you possibly on the top slide, the treatments with the untreated areas between them on the top picture, and on the bottom picture, the difference between a treated area and the control area where nothing happened. I have to say, on those conditions with that Molinia, with that soft track, we put a IVC full of water in the back of it to try rolling, and it had virtually no effect at all. We had done some rolling 3 years earlier with people that were up doing re-wetting nearby with swing shovels, which wasn't very efficient, but it actually had more effect. But it was in very, very wet conditions, but I think they were just relatively heavier. Next slide, please. Yes, interesting. I said to John, I want to know what's going on underneath. As a farmer, if I got some problem with a field, the first thing that would seem to me, you go and dig a soil profile pit. So this is an illustration of one of the soil profile pits that we've dug. And by the way, if you ever want an exercise, dig up a clump of Molinia. But it's nigh near impossible to get the stuff up. In this case, in the untreated areas, the Molinia, thick mat of Molinia roots stretched virtually all the way to the bottom, and it was which was 55-60 centimeters down. And although the roots obviously got finer, in the treated area there was much less dense roots, and that was just after one full growing season. So again, you can see a full-size penknife for reference to the size of it. Next slide, sorry. That's right. You can see a penknife that gives you relative size of the clump, and you can see some turf-like grasses that have colonized in the bare spaces between the Molinia. That's the other thing that we've got with the Molinia with us. There is a substantial amount of bare peat around the clump. In fact, probably we haven't analysed it, but it could be up to 50% bare peat. John.
Next slide, please. So I won't go into all the detail in this table, but this is a comparison of the different methods that we tried. As Philip said, rolling with the soft track only, even with additional weight, on that very clumpy Molinia didn't really seem to affect it enough. Flailing certainly did, but it was time consuming and used a lot of diesel to achieve, and did cause the machine to break down a number of times. Single pass harrowing didn't really have a big enough effect, but harrowing in two directions did seem to work reasonably well. So our general impression was that double harrowing was probably the most cost-effective way of working in those conditions. Next slide, please. So we then decided to do some further work. There are various issues that we noticed, such as the livestock coming into the treated areas in the summer of 2024 were causing erosion along certain routes, and they weren't finding all of the treated areas. So you'll see some of the turquoise things on the western side of the map were intended to join up the Molinia treatments from the acid grassland, which is very heavily grazed down in the valley to the west, and to try and draw the stock up towards the Molinia and towards the trials. So it was a rather more complex and slightly nuanced set of additional trials that we did in 2025. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Yeah, it's essential that you bring in sufficient grazing, but to a certain extent, because we wanted to do trials, we wanted a big enough uniform area so that we got similar uniform effects. But it very much illustrated that you needed to have access tracks at the very least into the Molinia for them to get the animals in, and as John said, they need to be wide enough to do the work. We tried harrowing in October. You just as well forget it. In our conditions, the Molinia is still too green and resilient at that time. You want it as wet as possible in March, which wasn't a particular problem at the beginning of March this year, but so it conditions can have an effect as well. Next slide, please. And once you get stock in, you need to be able to manage it, and that you also need. This is a picture of one of the access tracks in that we made. I think it's personally, you saw from one of the previous slides that John did, these tighter grazed areas, if it wasn't a trial, in my opinion, it would seem the logical thing to actually try and expand those areas rather than going into a forest of Molinia and trying to get something specifically into that area. But the other noticeable thing was that the trials weren't as good in 2025, because I think we'd done a bigger area, but also because it was hot, even on Dartmoor, and even on those areas, there was less water when you got up the top of the hill. So actually, the stock wasn't going up into away from the river valleys a tall well, which led us to the conclusion there's a more need to try and get more water into these upland areas. Next slide, please.
So we also, having looked at the routing in the different areas of treatment, we did some hand vane soil shear strength testing, and we did that in transects across the treatments and control areas, as well as in some sort of spot areas. So generally you would expect that peat would have a weaker shear strength if it's wetter and in better condition, and it would be higher where it's more dried out. And you'd also expect that plant roots would affect the shear strength where they're dominant. But the results so far are not really very conclusive, although some tests seem to be giving readings of about half the strength in the treated areas as against the nearby untreated areas at a range of different depths in the profile. So as Philip showed earlier, some of the treated areas appear quite rapidly within the first growing season to have a sort of reduction in the rooting of the Molinia. We're not really sure whether that's really genuinely the case or not, but that's our initial observation. And some of the shear strength measurements seem to be showing that up. But there's obviously a whole bunch of different factors at work there as well. And we certainly need a lot more study to understand, exactly what is determining the condition and the quality of the peat. And the one point that showed the highest shear strength, and which in a normal soil would mean compaction. It's a little bit different in peat, of course, because it's purely organic. But it was close to an old tinner's footpath, which is quite heavily used by walkers and even some riders nowadays. And because they keep this path open through the Molinia, then often the livestock follow that as well. So it does show that peat can be affected by other things just than Molinia. Next slide, please. So a range of other observations that we made. The root morphology, as we said, seems to change. We found that earthworms are present in quite a number of the Molinia clumps that we examined, which is quite surprising right up there on what should be very wet blanket bog, that earthworms have actually come in and the Molinia seems to aerate the upper peat enough for them to survive. So it does seem that some of the treatments allow other grasses to appear. They're presumably there already, but taking off the thick thatch and the shade from the Molinia clumps does help them to appear. And the other things we've already talked about, that harrowing is much better in the spring when the grass has died back, and it does seem to work better in very wet conditions. But this is still quite anecdotal. So the trials that Mariecia was talking about just now will hopefully put a bit of scientific rigor onto this anecdotal stuff. The next slide, please.
Yeah, thank you. This is a slide of the whole common with the fire breaks that we've put in. And as John said, we put some of them, as you can see at the far end, made them marry up with the trials that we were doing. So they did two purposes. Again, a learning curve. Don't make them too narrow. We put them in initially at sort of 6 meters wide. They need to be at least double that to allow stock in those conditions, and that'll vary according to the conditions that you're in. but generally you'll see there's many more of them on the southern tip part of the common. That is not Molinia area, that's dominated by gorse principally, a mixture of Western crossed with European, some of it. And there's a huge fire risk there. So those were cut initially at 6 meters. They've now been widened to 12. They also serve as access and management tracks for both commoners, but principally for access for the large number of people that come up onto that area. Next slide, please.
So near to the main set of trials in the northern part of the two commons, we've also done some peat re-wetting on a bit of blanket bog, which was disturbed about 90 years ago by a China clay works. So we're also interested to see whether that has a significant impact in reducing the Molinia coverage. That's only been there for a few years, and this is obviously a much slower process than one would expect with the physical trials that we've been doing. The next slide, please. So where do we go from here? Well, in order to help us to examine the rooting and dryness characteristics more easily in the peat, we've obtained coring soil augers, which make it a lot easier to look at a profile than digging it up. So we need to spend time out doing that, hopefully when the weather's a little bit better than it has been of late. So more studies with the shear vein meter to understand the physical conditions as well. We probably also need to look at peat moisture content comparisons under different treatments and see if that's having an effect. The statistically replicated trials that Mariecia was talking about and Tamsin with the land use management group, we're hoping to move on to. We're working to improve the inverted tine harrows, make them a little bit heavier and a little bit more robust. Our initial trials were with some old ones that Philip had hanging in a hedge at the edge of a field. And it's worked very well, but we need something a bit more robust, really, if we're going to do this on a significant scale. We also want to try some light burning of the Molinia thatch, because there is evidence from nearby commons that stock are brought in for grazing more by the regrowth of grass that's been burnt. And if that's an important way to bring in the stock to graze it and to sustain what we've done, then I think that's important. But we should also look at other inducements to bringing cattle in, such as spreading cobs or molasses on a pretty much daily basis to keep them moving through the Molinia. I think positive shepherding like that would be really valuable, but that's not being possible in the future because we're in a triple SI and that's currently not allowed, and nor is burning. So these are areas where we are basically in negotiation with Natural England to be able to try these on a controlled basis. Also, Philip mentioned the issue on the odd hot summer that we have with the lack of water up on top of the hill where the Molinia is. And so perhaps we need to create watering sites. And there are relatively straightforward ways of doing that. But again, it's a triple SI, and so this needs to be done carefully. And we also need to repeat some of these options where Molinia is encroaching onto the wet heath and even onto parts of the dry heath further south. There is evidence from some areas there where we've had fire breaks and so on that rolling might work better there, where the Molinia clumps haven't developed in the way that they have up in this very undergrazed area to the north of our commons. So that's our evidence for the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's certainly for me, and I'm sure for everyone listening, it was fantastic to see the sort of the theory put into practice, and to see that actually an evidence-based approach is what's going to lead us to the right answers, but also a site-based approach. That's some things work in one place and they don't work in another. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing, both of you. So we're going to move on now to Iona Blockley, who is in the Elan Valley, one of my favourite places. So yeah, over to you, Iona. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I'm Iona Blockley, the Elan Valley Trust Senior Peatland Officer. I'm just briefly sharing a piece of work that was done by UKCEH and Aberystwyth University with on-the-ground support from the Elan Valley Trust. Next slide, please. So just a bit of context, we are in the Cambrian Mountains in mid-Wales. It's a 70 square mile estate, and about a third of that is Molinia dominant. We and our tenant farmers have been cutting, grazing and re-wetting on Molinia, but we haven't done an awful lot of monitoring in the long term. Next slide, please. So the monitoring project that I'm talking about it's been done in the last year and was designed by UKCEH and AberUni. It was for projects like us to use to inform our management or restoration interventions, and a low-cost set of kit was developed and tested to make techniques such as greenhouse gas monitoring a bit more accessible to practitioners like us. Next slide, please. So the first thing was to find 3 sites that were quite representative of the Elan Valley and accessible for the kit. And then on the main site, we've got 4 plots, really. One is Molinia on deep peat, which is about 1.5 metres of peat. The other is Molinia on shallow peat, which was under 50 centimetres. And then we've got 2 on bare peat, one of which was unrestored and one which was recently restored. The restoration included re-wetting works with peat dams. And then there were 2 other sites where we repeated just the Molinia monitoring. Next slide, please. So there was a lot of kit installed, and I won't go into all of it, but quite importantly, the peat cameras and the manual and automatic dip wells. Next slide, please. Yeah, so another part of the project was creating a low-cost greenhouse gas chamber, which was done by UKCEH, which was tested on site compared to a research grade 1, just to make it more possible for us to use. Unfortunately, due to staff illness, it wasn't ready in time to do monitoring for a full year, so we plan to do that this year in combination with all the other monitoring to add the kind of CO2 fluxes into the data package. Next slide, please. So just a complicated flowchart, but basically I just wanted to say that the concept of the monitoring was to combine the CO2 data with the peat motion from the peat cameras and the hydrological data from the dip wells to get figures on emissions, peat subsidence or peat loss, and hydrological change, which can then help us to conclude what carbon loss is happening or restoration success is happening, and different factors like that. Next slide, please. So yeah, so far we've got 2 main outputs. We've got water table and peat motion. So firstly, the water table. The figures showing is a simplified change in water table across each sample plot over the test period, so it's a whole year. It's from the manual dip well, so it doesn't show all the ups and downs. It's a bit simpler, but it gives you an idea. So you can see the bare deep peat restored, that's quite stable. It rarely drops below the surface, so that water table stayed roughly within 10 centimetres of the surface all year round. The bare deep peat that was unrestored was kind of an intermediate, so it was lower than the restored area, but it wasn't as low as the Molinia areas. The Molinia on deep peat was the most dynamic water table, so there were rapid swings after rain, prolonged lows in dry periods, quite in line with what you'd expect Molinia to be happy on, really. And the Molinia shallow peat, unfortunately, was dry most of the time, so we didn't get much data to work with there. Next slide, please. So I won't go into the table too much, but it's just summarising the responses of each plot to rainfall or drying. In summary, the Molinia on deep peat showed the fastest and largest decline in water table after rain, whereas the deep peat restored drained slowly and often maintained its elevated water table for several days after the rain. And the bare deep peat was kind of in the middle again. And after dry periods, similarly, so the Molinia on deep peat was pronounced in its decline in water table, and the bare deep peat was sensitive but less extreme, and the restored was fairly stable, so same kind of patterns. The Molinia on shallow peat was, again, often dry, but when there was data, it was kind of a moderate in the middle as well for drainage and drought sensitivity. Basically, it's just showing us that water retention capabilities improve after hydrological restoration, and they're really at their worst with the Molinia over the deep peat in this trial. Next slide, please. So the second output that we can talk about is peat motion. Just briefly to explain how we've got this, we've got a camera on a stool that's fixed onto the peat surface, so it's moving with the peat as it shrinks and swells. And then there's an anchored pole with a ruler on it, and that doesn't move. So regular pictures from the camera to the ruler show the changes in the peat surface. Next slide, please. So this graph is just showing the fluctuations in the peat surface. It's reflecting the shrink and swell effect. It aligns quite nicely with the water table, as you'd expect, the surface being at its lowest in the summer and rising up in the winter as it's wetter. But the interesting part of this is that the peat surface didn't return to the level it was the year previous, which could indicate peat loss. It does need another year of data and further investigation to be sure, but it's looking like peat loss. If you can see on the table, it's a lot lower when you come round to the end. So the shallow peat site recorded the lowest peat subsidence, so potentially the lowest peat loss. The Molinia on deep peat had the highest, with bare deep peat coming the second highest, and the restored zone presented a small subsidence rate, indicating that the restoration works have effectively reduced carbon loss, although we would like to see no carbon loss, of course, but the restoration was very fresh, so hopefully after another year of data collection, we shouldn't see any peat loss, hopefully. Next slide, please. So just briefly, we aim to keep going for another year and add in the CO2 values from the emissions collars. We'd like to investigate further the subsidence in the Molinia, just to check, because it is a bit more than you'd expect to see in peat loss, or quite a lot more than we'd expect. But generally, we can see so far that the Molinia dominance over deep peat has even more hydrological and subsidence issues than the bare deep peat, which I was quite surprised about. We can also see that rewetting works on the bare peat area stabilise the water table and reduce peat loss. So the evidence is pointing strongly to hydrological restoration. So we do some of this, but we need to be monitoring it, with a more robust method, basically going forward. Obviously, in many areas, it's not so possible to re-wet. It's not simple. You haven't got the deep peat to use, or it's too steep. So we need to be trialling and monitoring different ways of managing Molinia that don't involve peat bunding. So cutting, grazing, sphagnum planting, surface bunding, other kinds of methods, basically. It'd be also interesting to assess if restoration work should be a priority on the shallow peat or not with the Molinia. Questions like, the emissions data from these areas, is peat formation occurring but based on like precipitation and soil moisture rather than that high water table? Have conditions worsened and how can they be improved? We are contributing to a piece of follow-on work led by UKCEH for DEFRA, carrying out an evidence review for Molinia management on peatlands, which will be ready in a few months as well. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Iona. It's really interesting to see the difference in the differences in the research that you're doing and what you're finding. And I think that has relevance across all areas and where people are thinking about Molinia and restoration of sites. So can I ask all of our panelists to put their videos on? And we have a few minutes for a Q&A. So we've had some questions answered in the chat, which is fantastic. So I'm just going to go straight to Mariecia. We've got a question about feed blocks. So have feed blocks been used to attract stock onto Molinia and encourage them to stay?
Yes, and I think Adrian had answered that for Dartmoor, but yes, that can be a very effective way of manipulating grazing. And I just wanted to add there as well. So we know from the work we've done sampling Molinia and looking at its nutritional value to stock across the growing season. We know that in terms of particularly protein, it's a reasonable protein concentration it's got, but it's low in energy. So the sugars, think about your high sugar grasses, it's the other end of the scale, very low in sugars. So something like molasses that Philip and John mentioned as well, using that, you potentially manipulating the grazing and improving your nutritional value for your stock and basically the efficiency, the use, which is always a good thing.
Fantastic. Adrian, a question from Gwyn. So Gwyn has said favourable condition blanket bog, mostly, or still a lot of wet heath. Are there any plans for hydrology-led interventions and trials, or is it all direct vegetation management? I think there needs to be a field-based response to the apparent natural England view that just hydrology restoration will do the job as long as peat is less than 30 centimetres. And he, in brackets, they might be right, but they might not be. What are your thoughts on that question, Adrian?
Well, I guess we can kind of dovetail it in a bit with what the Southwest Peatland Partnership are doing. I mean, they're doing quite a lot of work on the deep peat, but in terms of on these lower level ones, I mean, don't really know very much that's happening on thin peat, to be honest, in terms of trying to re-wet. I mean, I think one of the things we probably also have to kind of take into account, even if we don't want to, is that the notion that we might be able to get these back to what they purportedly were X years ago might actually prove very, very difficult now, because we haven't actually mentioned nitrogen deposition this evening, but I mean, Dartmoor and lots of upland areas get absolutely coated in nitrogen deposition, which is acting as a fertilizer, kind of plants like Molinia particularly like that. And then obviously we've got climate change on top of that as well. And it does beg the question of whether we're looking at novel ecosystems here, and where they're going to go in the future is partly down to how we manage them, but partly down to where they want to go.
Thank you. John and Philip, there's a question here from Nick Vinney. Is there any appetite for more nature-based solutions like very high density cattle, supplementary fed cattle moved daily just for their trampling effects, or a restoration phase?
Well, we're limited because it's in an agri-environment scheme now. So we couldn't increase cattle numbers or livestock numbers at all if we wanted to without breaking the HLS agreement. That's the first point I would make. So I think we're working with what we've got, basically. And if you wanted to try those sort of areas, you'd really have to do it or sort of in large, more enclosed new takes, because in that terrain, people talk about putting collars on cows, but you very soon run into a welfare situation if, even in the summer, you're either shutting them in areas where there's, well, no water, or more particularly, the weather can change very quickly and you're left with them stuck on some hillside where they can't get away from. So I think that those sort of things I have a bit of doubt about, but fundamentally, we haven't got enough stock to actually expand the area in terms of trialing. We've got to spread out what's there, and there's no point in moving it somewhere and just ending up with a heap of Molinia in another area.
Excellent.
I think the answer is it should be tried, but we can't at the moment.
Yeah. So you're limited actually by those schemes. Your ambition is really, it's palpable actually, what you would like to trial and what you'd like to achieve. And I think that's something that's come across tonight, is there is huge ambition across the country on moorland for managing Molinia. So one question that's come up, or a topic that's come up in a few questions here, is the question of burning as a management tool. Is that a point that any of you would like to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you wouldn't use burning as a management tool if we thought we could do it better through other ways. But I don't think it's necessarily bad as long as it works as a light burn and you're basically only burning off the above ground grass, which is going to be volatilized fairly soon, over a period of a year or two anyway. And if it helps to reduce the Molinia dominance, which, as Iona was saying, is leading to a lot of peat loss anyway and carbon loss, and if it helps us to see what we're doing so that we can re-wet the peat and get the peat back to a healthy condition so that it's tying up more and more carbon, then it's worth the risk and the loss of a little bit of carbon through the actual burn.
Yeah, I could be persuaded to allow a one-off burn on peat that was less than 20 centimeters, but the thing that we don't want to get back to, I don't think, is how things were in the past when it was used as a routine way of just kind of getting rid of excess grass. And there's quite a strong argument that one of the reasons that Molinia is dominant now is because of those past practices.
I think it's how it's done as well, and it must be done as a cool burn, not in very dry conditions. The understory needs to be wet and the top just dry enough to burn off the top of it. But that would be the only thing that we would trial, I think. The only other point that it has been, I think, used in a few areas down here on some, and that is actually if you feed the cattle out through December and through November, December, out on some of these areas, probably not this real deep peat, but if you feed them with cobs, then they will actually still chew the Molinia off until you get to, in our conditions, until you get to about mid-January, and then they get fed up with it, but the Molinia becomes less palatable, although it looks unpalatable from the mid-September.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So it is 9 o'clock and I'm very conscious that everyone has given up their evening to join us. For those of you watching, I will be sending a copy of the recording to you along with the slides and the Q&A answers. So you've got those to look back on. There are a couple of extra slides on here from Jean Johnson, who is a Natural England advisor in the Lake District. She's got some really good points that she'd like to make, and they're included at the end of the slides that you can look at when they come to you. Susie is going to pop a poll up for the, and we'd love you to answer, please. And please, can you give us some ideas for topics for future webinars? We really want to make sure that these are useful to you and help to improve delivery on common land. While we're waiting for that poll to complete, Robin, I've got a final question for you. So Ewan has asked, how confident are we that SFI will be available to the large cohort of commons whose HLS agreements expire in 2028? And given the lead-in time, we need clarity on the CS higher tier position for commons well in advance of 2028, effectively in the next few weeks. I'm very conscious of this, as in the New Forest, our HLS expires in 2028, and it will take a long time to develop our scheme. So, Robin, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm ever the optimist. We've highlighted the issues. We are talking to DEFRA and the RPA, and they have actually, to be fair, admitted where the pinch points are. So it's given us the opportunities to work proactively with them now and suggest we've got to get this to happen and happen fast. We cannot get to the stage where expiries are happening in numbers with absolutely no way of moving forward. So yes, I have a degree of confidence. I have to say that, because otherwise it wouldn't be worth keeping working with them. But I think that's part of the role that we have to do, is highlight that. Yes, I would hope that by 2028 we should be able to transition, budget permitting, of course.
Excellent. Thank you, Robin. I will have a really good look. Thank you to all of you who've added some ideas for webinars. Brilliant to see that. For most of you, this was a really useful webinar. I've certainly enjoyed it, and I'd like to offer my huge thanks to all of our panelists this evening. It is absolutely brilliant that you've shared your expertise and your experience with us all tonight. So yeah, huge thanks and good night, everyone.